Hi everyone, I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed champion guide. Today I'll be talking about Varesh the Eternal, and so please sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Varesh is a strong range DPS champion who excels in dealing damage from afar with his powerful range attacks and debuffs. In terms of dealing damage, he has some good burst and AoE damage dealing options, and so this allows him to deal damage to enemies in various different scenarios. Even though Varesh is a ranged champion, he is surprisingly survivable in the right hands since he has 3 or 4 different ways to escape or mitigate damage and a little bit of built-in self-sustain as he is trying to do damage to the enemies. I think that's pretty awesome. In terms of control, Varesh doesn't really have any hard CCs like incapacitates or petrifies, but what he does have are snares, silences, and perhaps mini stuns as well if he chooses a certain Battlerites. I suppose in most situations this is quite sufficient for an already strong champion at a distance with multiple ways to escape and mitigate damage. Varesh definitely has quite a bit going for him, and so I think he's a good champion to pick up provided you have good mechanical skills. I feel. I find that Varesh isn't really beginner friendly at all, and so for this reason, some time and practice will probably be needed to properly play Varesh. So yeah, before we start, just like the other champion guides I have made previously for Sirius and Bako, to name a few, I have split this guide up into different sections, and I've included timestamps directly to each section in the description below. As usual, feel free to skip ahead to the section that you need if you've already watched the video before. And again, we'll start the guide off with looking at Varesh's abilities before talking about his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Then we'll look at his Battlerites options, and finally we finish off with some of my gameplay tips and potential combos when using Varesh. And so without further ado, let's begin. First off, let's talk about his abilities one by one. Varesh's Mouse 1 ability is Hand of Corruption, and this is his basic ranged attack. What it does is Varesh will shoot a blue projectile forward which deals some decent damage on the target that it hits, and in addition to the damage, successful hits with this ability heals Varesh for a small amount and applies the Corruption debuff on enemies as well. While the tiny heal is helpful to sustaining Varesh's health quite a bit, the Corruption debuff is the interesting part of this ability. The Corruption debuff lasts for 5 seconds on the enemy, and while it is on the target, said target will deal 15% reduced damage and healing, which is quite massive I would say. The reason this is so good is because you can maintain the debuff on every enemy, and the enemies will have to work extra hard just to deal as much damage or healing as they normally would. This is a significant boost to your team's survivability, as well as a significant reduction to the enemy team's survivability, provided you maintain the debuff on all enemies. And so I think making sure the debuff is applied on all the enemies should be a part of your game plan as Varesh, since the effects are so good. Next up, Varesh's right click or mouse 2 ability is Hand of Judgment, and this is Varesh's long casting time but strong range attack. What it does is Varesh will launch a pink projectile after a short cast delay, and this projectile will deal a large amount of damage to the target that it hits. Successful hits on the enemy will inflict the Judgment debuff on the target, and what this debuff does is that it will increase the damage taken by said target by 15% for 5 seconds. This debuff is very handy at taking down tankier enemies, and so don't disregard its effects. With that being said though, I wouldn't recommend casting Varesh's Mouse 2 that often even though it has a low cooldown, because Varesh is stationary while casting. This makes him very susceptible to damage and pressure, so try to use it only in relative safety, just like you would when using Jumong's Mouse 2 ability. Moving on, Varesh's spacebar ability is Inhibitor's Guard, and this is Varesh's primary survival ability. What it does is very simple, since it basically is just a shield ability. Like Lucy's spacebar ability, this ability can be casted on allies of Varesh himself, and a 28 point shield will be applied on the target instantly. Because the shield lasts 2.5 seconds, you'll typically want to use it just before incoming damaging attacks to fully make use of the shield. That's about it really, pretty simple for now. If you take some of the Battlerites that augment this shield ability, then there'll be a bit more things to consider at that point, but we'll get to that later in the Battlerites section. Next up, Varesh's Q ability is Wuju, and this is Varesh's counter ability. What it does is that when an enemy attack or projectile hits a countering Varesh, Varesh will teleport to a targeted location after a brief delay, during which Varesh is actually invulnerable and out of the fight, and the enemies within a small area at the landing location will be knocked back a small distance. The knockback itself doesn't really do any damage, but if the targets in the landing area has the Judgment debuff on them, that's the pink debuff, then the debuff will be consumed, and the targets affected will be inflicted with 8 damage and the silence debuff. If Varesh lands on the target in the area with the Corruption debuff, that's the blue one from Varesh's Mouse 1 ability, then the debuffs will be consumed and the targets will be snared for a short while. In addition, Varesh is also healed for a different amount for each corruption debuff consumed this way. This debuff consumption effect that comes with the Vuju ability makes it so that Varesh can sometimes be a bit more aggressive by teleporting right on top of enemies with debuffs, so that's something to keep in mind of should you need to be more aggressive at times. If the enemy doesn't have any debuffs on them though, then it becomes hardly worth it to teleport right on top of them. It is usually the smarter and safer play to teleport to a further away location in that case, and so a little bit of split second decision making is kind of required when playing Varesh as well. Moving on, Varesh's E ability is Shatter, and what it does is that Varesh can spawn an exploding shard at a targeted location, which would deal a decent amount of area damage when it explodes after a brief delay. The area of effect of the ability isn't very big, and so targeting it might be hard, but the results are pretty good if you manage to land them on enemies which already have your corruption or judgment debuffs on them. Just like the Q ability, when the judgment debuff is consumed, bonus damage and silence is applied to the enemies that were hit, and when the corruption debuff is consumed, the enemies that were hit are snared and Varesh gets a bit of healing as well. Some good practice will probably be required to make the most out of this ability, so definitely use it often and get used to aiming it. Since the ability has 2 charges, you will have it ready more often than not, so there's no real harm spamming it a bit as well. The only downside to spamming it is you slow down your movement speed a bit every time you cast it. I recommend getting used to using it properly since it can be useful not only to activate those debuffs, but to zone enemies, attack people behind walls, peel for your teammates and all sorts of good stuff basically, so quite a versatile and strong ability I would say. And so those were all of Varesh's abilities that doesn't cost energy. Now let us move on to those which do. Starting with Varesh's R ability. Varesh's R ability is Kinetic Energy, and what it does for 25 energy is Varesh will vanish for a brief moment and then he'll quickly dash in a targeted direction. This dash can go through walls and enemies, and when it does go through enemies, a Shatter Shard will spawn beneath each enemy you pass through. This Shatter Shard functions just like how they would normally if you had casted them with your E ability, and so this ability is a pretty good way of dodging attacks while being offensive at the same time. While I usually mainly use this ability for surviving stuff, sometimes it can be worth it to use it just for the Shatter Shard. An example is like when you want to consume the debuffs on the enemy before they expire, but you can't afford to spend some time to aim and cast your E ability manually. So yeah, quite a versatile ability I would say. Next up, Varesh's first EX ability is his Shift Right Click ability, Hand of Punishment. What this ability does for 25 energy is that it allows Varesh to shoot a projectile that will deal a medium amount of damage to the target that it hits. The target it hits will also be inflicted with both the Judgment and Corruption debuffs, so this ability is a very good way of applying those debuffs quickly if you need them up as soon as possible. The best part of this ability is that it allows Varesh a way to move while shooting a projectile, which can apply the Judgment or pink color debuff. Varesh's base Mouse 2 ability requires him to stand still to cast it, and most of the time it is not convenient to do so. Using the EX version of this ability is much better just for applying the debuff, since you can move while you cast and all you sacrifice is a bit of damage basically. Moving on, Varesh's second EX ability is his EXE ability, Crush. What it does for 25 energy is that Varesh will spawn a larger exploding shard at a targeted location, much bigger in area than the normal E ability version by the way. And this exploding shard will deal damage to all enemies in the area after a brief delay, just like the normal E ability. This ability consumes the debuffs and applies those aforementioned effects just like the E ability, but the major difference with this ability as compared to the normal E ability is the fact that this exploding shard will knock back all enemies away from the center of the explosion. Therefore, this ability can basically be used to create space for yourself should you need it, zone enemies, create space for your teammates, proc the debuffs and all that good stuff. The knockback even works with the orb as well, and so using this ability to knock the orb forward for your team is often a good move when you're trying to secure the orb for your team. Finally, Varesh's ultimate ability on the F key is Powers Combine, and what it does is Varesh will vanish for a bit before he starts to dash up to 3 separate times. Each of this dash, which works just like Varesh's R dash, deals a significant amount of damage to each enemy it passes through, and it also applies both debuffs onto the enemy it hits. You can continue to dash again up until you have dashed a total of 3 times, which is the maximum of dashes you can do. All in all, the total damage you deal to a single target if you dash into them 3 times is about 80 damage, so it's definitely very powerful if you can do that. Bear in mind you can hit multiple enemies with it too, so the potential for this ultimate ability to swing the round in benefit of your team is tremendous. I'd say do use it if you can afford to, but just be wary that the range of the dash is quite short, so make sure that the enemies have used up their escape cooldowns first to make the most out of the ability. It's not very often you may be able to use the ultimate ability, since all of Varesh's ability which costs energy is quite useful, but with good energy management it is possible to pull it off while making proper use of his other abilities as well. And so that's about it for Varesh's abilities. Now let us move on to his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Varesh's playstyle is a bit of a hang back and deal damage from afar kind of playstyle. His skills and abilities favour this sort of playstyle since you want to be in a position where you can easily apply debuffs, deal damage, control the fight and so on. This is where Varesh really shines the most to me. While it is significantly easier to hit his ranged attacks if he was nearer to the enemy, it also means that you're more likely to get focused, so you would probably need to be a bit more alert and careful when doing so. It's certainly not impossible for Varesh to be trying to deal damage at a closer distance since he does have multiple escape and survival options, but it really helps with aiming and controlling the fight when you don't need to constantly worry about your survival and the amount of pressure your opponents are putting on you. In terms of his abilities, I typically hang back and spam my mouse 1 ability to damage and debuff the nearest enemy. I'll spread the debuff to as many enemies as I can if it is safe and convenient to do so. When I feel like the enemies are not paying attention to me at all, then I would safely try to put in 1 or 2 mouse 2 shots as well if I can. While spamming mouse 1s, I would try to weave in a few E or EXE abilities here and there to control the fight by zoning the enemies or to prompt debuffs for snares and or silence when it is necessary. The damage from these abilities are mostly just a bonus I think, like it's nice to get it if you can, but the zoning capabilities and CC effects are what you're after. If I have multiple debuffs that are already on multiple enemies and they happen to line up, then I might consider doing an aggressive R dash to try to deal as much AoE damage as I can with the shatters that spawn from the R ability. Just be careful when you do decide to commit for this, since you'll be left with 1 less escape cooldown for 15 seconds. While just passively doing my thing, shooting and using shatters or crushes from afar, I'll be looking out for a few things as well. I'll be looking to see if my teammate needs my shield from my spacebar, and I'll also try to stay alert of enemy attacks on myself in case I need to shield myself or to use my counter. Deciding whether to use the counter teleport aggressively or defensively is up to you and will most likely depend on the situation, so this is something that you'll get the hang of after having more games with Varesh. Sometimes when you decide to apply increased pressure on the enemies so that they back off, perhaps because they are going really aggressively on your teammate or even yourself, you can try to use your EX Mouse 2 ability for this. The silence and snare you apply on the enemy when consuming both debuffs are very good at creating space, so putting both debuffs at once and consuming them right after with a counter, E or EXE ability will often give enough space for you or your teammate to get away. When you find yourself with enough energy for an ultimate ability, I would probably try to back off a bit and kind of continue using your abilities that doesn't require energy, until you find a good chance to use your ultimate ability of course. Wait till they have used up their escapes and just go crazy with the ultimate ability basically. If at any point before using the ultimate ability, the enemies decide to focus you or your teammate down, and you absolutely need to use some of your energy consuming abilities, then by all means use them, since you lose out more if you don't. So yeah. Gameplay wise, Varesh is mostly quite simple since most of his skills have a rather defined purpose. It is the mechanical skill to play Varesh effectively that is slightly tougher to achieve I feel. Just gotta keep practicing I suppose. On to some of his strengths, I think that one of Varesh's strengths is his survivability. Due to his access to 3 non-ultimate survival abilities, Varesh can actually survive for quite a long time even without healing from a support teammate. And so this really opens up opportunities for Varesh to turn games around and make really impressive plays. Varesh being so survivable might have the added benefit of enemies not wanting to attack into him, since they might think that Varesh is just going to survive through it anyways, and this could leave Varesh with lots of space to really do his thing on his enemies. Next up, I think that another strength of Varesh's is his zoning capabilities. Varesh's abilities make him feel like a turret of sorts, and so his ability to zone people is really quite powerful. Both his mouse 1 and mouse 2 attacks are painful and damaging since the debuffs they apply are so strong, and his E ability is good as well because it procs those debuffs for powerful effects. These powerful attacks that can be casted from afar by Varesh really makes it so that enemies are afraid to be within Varesh's area of influence, and by that I mean the range at which Varesh's abilities can hit somebody, and so this often makes it very easy for Varesh to separate enemies and keep them apart by zoning them. This separating the enemies and zoning them strategy is a pretty good all-around strategy for winning most matches, and so I would say Varesh is a pretty strong character since he can perform this strategy quite well with just a little bit of backup from the teammate. Finally, I think that Varesh is a pretty good pickup against other ranged enemies. His abilities are really powerful, but they have reasonably long cast times, and so I think they are more effective at hitting targets further away as compared to when they are nearer. Surely aiming a projectile at a nearer enemy is easier, but if the enemy is up close in melee range, the long cast time of most Varesh's damaging abilities can make it quite hard to hit those abilities onto melee enemies, and so I feel like he's stronger against other ranged enemies just because of the fact that his abilities being stronger than that of other ranged enemies, and they are also easier to hit against enemies at medium distance away from Varesh. This actually brings me to Varesh's weakness towards melee enemies. As I mentioned, those long cast times on some of his damaging abilities, even his mouse 1 ability, can be a bit difficult to aim toward melee enemies who are dancing around you, and that's why I think Varesh is slightly weaker toward melee enemies. There are ways to get around some of this, which I'll get into in the Battlerites section, but without some Battlerites, it can be a little tough to deal with some of these pesky melee champions, I feel. Moving on, I think that another weakness of Varesh's is his over-reliance on energy. All of his abilities that cost energy are good, and they are also strictly better versions of some of his basic abilities that doesn't require energy. For this reason, there are times where you'll find yourself starved of energy, but you really need that energy to do what you want to do next, and this is a pretty bad situation to be in, but it's quite common to get stuck in that situation because of how energy reliant Varesh is. So yeah, energy management is quite key here to combat this weakness of Varesh's. Finally, I think Varesh's biggest weakness is the lack of hard CC. I suppose giving Varesh a form of hard CC might make him too strong, but I find that he can sometimes suffer from the lack of hard CC because there are just some situations where it's just too hard to live through or too hard to overcome basically without the use of hard CC. And so if you're not careful when playing Varesh, the lack of access to hard CC might mean death, so do be a bit cautious in terms of your positioning with Varesh, otherwise it can get pretty rough I think. And so yeah, that's about it for his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Now let us move on to Varesh's Battlerites options. Once again, you can pause the video to slowly read through every single Battlerites if you wish before I go through my thoughts on his Battlerites, since it will take a long while for me to read it all out for you. And so pause now to read them all. In the first tier, I think that the pick would almost always be Chyill. Devastation seems good in terms of maximizing damage, but you'll hardly ever be able to stand still and cast mouse 2 so many times without being focused on shortly after, so I think it's just an okay pick. Return can be good potentially as well, but ever since the change to Varesh's counter or Wuju ability, the Return Battlerites isn't as attractive anymore since the ability doesn't have a stun anymore. Chyill on the other hand makes it so that there will be a stun applied onto all nearby enemies when Inhibitor's Guard is applied onto a character. It even applies the Corruption debuff, that's the blue one, to the enemies hit by the shockwave, and so it is quite handy if you just want to easily apply the debuff onto an enemy. Really though, the big thing about his Battlerites is the stun, since it is super handy when dealing with pesky melee champions, and sometimes even against enemy ranged champions as well. The stun can cancel enemy counters, interrupt channeling, disrupt their combos, etc. And so I think it is super useful in a lot of situations because you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone when you apply a shield onto an ally and stun everyone around them briefly. It's so good that every time you use it and successfully stun an enemy, you have a much higher chance of winning that little trade against the enemy. So yeah, just pick Chyill in the first round unless you have some special game plan you're trying to do with the other Battlerites. Moving on, in the second tier, I think all the choices are actually pretty okay. Celerity applies a very strong movement and damage buff when you apply Inhibitor's Guard on the target, and so I think it is really handy in a lot of situations regardless of the enemy team composition. Silence and Unlimited Power on the other hand relies a little bit on hitting your shatters, so it might be a little unreliable as compared to Celerity. But in rounds where you're up against all ranged enemies and you're fairly good at aiming those shatters, these Battlerites are quite worth it since you gain quite a bit of value from them. The extra silence duration helps against some of the more slippery enemies, and the Corruption debuff being reapplied to the enemy when they are hit by shatter helps against some of the more damaging abilities since the Corruption debuff stays on them for longer. So yeah, overall there are quite some nice pickups this round. If you're in doubt of what to pick though, then just get Celerity since it is always good. Next up, in the third round, I think that the pickup will largely depend on what you picked up in the previous rounds. Ruin is a pretty good pickup if you picked up Return in the first round, since you have more chances of making use of Ruin with the extra Q recasts, The Battlerite allows you to play a bit more aggressively with your Chyill ability, and so it can sometimes be quite fun just teleporting everywhere and silencing enemies left and right with these two Battlerites. Fracture makes it so that you're more likely to have your E ability ready, so this is quite useful against ranged enemies and if you have the silence or unlimited power Battlerite from round 2. More shatter charges means more chances to silence or consuming those corruption charges on enemies, not to mention the extra zoning capabilities you get from it. The Wonder Battlerite is pretty straightforward and it is just a direct buff to your team's survivability. If you have been taking the Battlerites which improve your spacebar ability in the previous rounds, then Wonder will be a very good pick since it is kind of like activating God mode for a while, maybe every 10 seconds or so, whenever your spacebar ability is ready. So yeah, pick up what you need depending on what you picked the previous rounds I think. The extra damage absorbed by Inhibitor's Guard isn't mandatory, and so there's a bit of room for some choice in this round. Next up, in the 4th tier, I think that all of the choices are pretty good. Agility straight up improves your mobility, and so during times where you don't have spacebar, Q or R ready to save yourself, then the increased move speed would perhaps help you in surviving and dealing damage a bit better. Lawbender makes it so that your spacebar ability is ready more often, which is always handy especially if your Battlerites in the previous rounds have always revolved around buffing your spacebar ability. I'd argue that if you can consistently hit your shatters, then Lawbender would most likely be your best pickup this round, purely just for the insane cooldown reduction that you get on your spacebar ability. If you're not as confident at hitting those shatters, then Synergy would be a pretty good pick since all you need to do is apply both debuffs onto a single person and keep both up with your normal mouse ones. This Battlerite makes your EX mouse 2 super strong since you can use it to quickly apply both debuffs and maintain them with your mouse ones. The 20% reduction in damage and healing dealt plus the 20% increased damage taken will make it so that the enemy is unlikely to win trades, and so just having the debuffs on them without consuming them is a pretty viable tactic too, if you're not as good at landing those shatters for those silence and snare effects. Personally, I would try to observe and take into consideration my enemy's playstyle when I'm trying to make a Battlerite choice for this round. There are times when enemies are bad at avoiding shatters, then Lawbender is good for me. Sometimes I feel like it was very painful trying to maintain debuffs on the enemy, then Synergy is a good pickup for example. So yeah, just go with what you need for this round I suppose. Finally, in the 5th and final round, I think that Eternal will be the better pick most of the time. Unless your teammate is constantly sticking to the enemy, it is hard to get value out of the Accord Battlerite, and so I think Eternal will give you more value overall. Not to mention the Inhibitor's Guard you get at the end of the ultimate ability will benefit from the Battlerites in the previous round, and so you'll even be able to have a mini stun at the end together with the movement and damage buffs and all that, so a very solid Battlerite indeed. And so definitely pick Eternal over the other most of the time. That's about it on Varesh's Battlerites. Now let us move on to some of my gameplay tips for playing Varesh as well as some potential combos with him. My first tip for playing Varesh is to take the time to learn his abilities and what they really do. Varesh's abilities look very complex at first glance because of the really long descriptions in game, but ultimately they really boil down to 2 debuffs that Varesh can put out. And so once you get the hang of them, like once you understand what they do, how to use them, when to use them and all that, you'll find that you'll be able to make much better decisions when playing Varesh and ultimately win your trades and rounds more easily. Next up, another tip I have for playing Varesh is to try not to draw too much attention to yourself. Varesh works best when he's not under pressure because he can sit at a safe spot and take the time to aim properly and deal massive damage. When he's under pressure from enemy attacks, it's hard to aim properly and make the right decisions in those scenarios, so definitely try not to attract too much unwanted attention as Varesh. The exception to this is I suppose when your teammate is the kind of teammate who cannot cope with pressure at all, even more so than Varesh, then perhaps you might need to step up and take that pressure. Outside of that situation, I'd recommend trying not to be the one taking the pressure to really maximize the damage output with Varesh. Moving on, another tip I have for playing Varesh is to work together with your teammate. Varesh has some supportive capabilities in the form of his spacebar shield and knockback with his Shift E, and so definitely use them to your team's advantage when you can. Perhaps use them to save your teammate, create space for them to work with, etc. Having a teammate alive takes a lot of pressure off of Varesh, and so it is very worth it in trying to keep them alive for as long as you can as well, since that translates to you being able to do more damage eventually. Finally, my last tip for playing Varesh is to learn to capitalize on his strength at zoning people by having good positioning. As I mentioned, Varesh is like a turret which can deal lots of damage if left unchecked. The key here to being able to really zone people and do good damage is good positioning. If you can learn to position yourself correctly in relation to your teammates and your enemies, you can really do quite a lot in terms of zoning and good damage as a Varesh. By asserting dominance over the battlefield earlier in the fight, and knowing that your ally is in a good position to back you up, it will be tough for enemies to make good trades into your formation. Because you will have the upper hand when you're well prepared, the enemies will have to take some risks to break your formation if they want to have a better chance at winning the round. The best thing to do to greatly increase your chances of winning that round in such a scenario is to capitalize on the mistakes the enemies make when they try to break your formation. So definitely try to look out for those mistakes and punish them enemies. In terms of combos, I don't really know of any basic and notable combos that could be useful to a person learning Varesh, so we'll just move straight on to team compositions. I think that Varesh works very well with other support or melee champions, more so than other ranged DPS champions. Most of the time, ranged DPS champions would want to hang back and deal damage as well, maybe not Ismo, but most of them are like that. And so between Varesh and other ranged champions, Varesh is the slightly tankier and more survivable one typically, and so he'll likely have to be the one in front of the team in most cases. This makes it quite hard for Varesh to perform optimally, and so I think it can sometimes be quite tough to play in those cases, especially against a good team who will try to focus you down. Melee teammates are good teammates to Varesh, I feel, because of the fact that they just draw lots of attention to them. The less attention you have on you as a Varesh, the better, and so having a good melee teammate to draw those attention away is super helpful. In return, you provide your teammate with cover fire and strong DPS on the enemies trying to attack into your teammates. I feel that support champions also make good teammates for Varesh because the healing that they provide would really benefit the already decently tanky Varesh. It is actually quite difficult to take down a Varesh who properly uses his escapes and survival abilities and has a good support teammate healing him from the side, so I think that's a pretty strong composition to have. Don't forget that during all of this, Varesh will still be attacking and retaliating as well, so it can sometimes be a real pain to deal with such a composition if you're not fully prepared for it. And so yeah, Varesh is really quite a fun champion to play. I like the challenge involved in playing Varesh properly, from aiming his E, to getting the timing on his attacks correctly, to managing the debuffs on enemies, to making decisions on what debuffs to proc and so on, and so I really recommend trying out Varesh for yourself if you enjoy this sort of micromanagement, I suppose. His ability to really dish out damage when left unchecked is quite amazing, and so I suppose that could be really fun too if you have a good teammate covering for you. All in all, a good champion to pick up, but just be prepared to put some practice into him before you expect to do a whole lot with him. And so yeah, that's about it for my Varesh guide. I hope you found it useful. The next guide I have in line is an Ivar guide, since that is the only champion left in the current roster, which I haven't covered in a video, so she'll have a chance to shine in 2 weeks time. After I finish Ivar's guide, I'll probably be looking to revisit some of the older and more outdated guides and do some updates to them, so I hope you look forward to that. All in all, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like it, comment on it, share this video, and you can check out my other videos too if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching my video, and until next time guys, have a great day, keep gaming, stay chill, and I'll see you guys in the next one, okay? Bye bye.